So I have a question about. You were saying earlier that this is a debate that's happened before. This is not a new sort of a rejection of the presence, maybe a rejection of something. So what did they reject? What did they keep? And did they see themselves as a corrective? Did they see themselves as saying, okay, well, we can keep Buddha nature, but we need to interpret it? Or did they just say a whole scale cutting, rejecting, and moving on to some new purified Buddhism that will...
They meaning Hakamaya
and Matsumoto.
Yeah, they talk about returning to real Buddhism or pure Buddhism.
By which they mean?
It's almost like Hinayana Buddhism, right? I mean, to use the
Matsumoto reduces, that's why there's the two fruits left on the Bodhi tree. He kind of reduces everything to emptiness and paticca-samutpada, and anything that smells of a dhatu is an atman dhatu, it can't be accepted. So that's the real position of Buddhism.
And what about the rest of the Mahayana path? Right. Compassion.
Tantra.
Good question.
Well, they're being doctrinal about this, but they're really kind of philosophical. So people oftentimes accuse them, and in the volume you see it, accuse them of being fundamentalist. Looking for the true Buddhism, as like back looking for the historical Jesus kind of stuff, right? And they criticize them for that. I mean, again, this is the postmodern moment. We don't need to worry about if we could even find if we had a video recording of what the Buddha said. But they weren't really interested in that. They Matsumoto, again, and kind of infamously said, even if we discover that the Buddha himself said Buddha nature is the true reality, we have to say he was wrong. So it's a philosophical. It's not a historically fundamentalist. It's a philosophically fundamentalist kind of point of view. And so, the question of tantra doesn't come up. Compassion comes up a lot. And so in other things, particularly both of them also have written about the Pure Land Buddhist schools. The founders of Pure Land, Shinran and Honen, both of them wrote on those followers too. So. They did branch out, but Tantra, as far as I know, Tantra didn't come in. And they never really framed it in terms of Mahayana and Triyana kinds of things. It was more, what's left is Praticca-samutpada and maybe Praticca-samutpada.
So they don't write, as far as I know, they haven't written specifically about what sort of practices then they would. I assume that they accept the various practices within their tradition, living a moral life, and other Mahayana practices. Hakamaya is an ordained priest of the Soto school. I think that's why it could never turn into a kind of a new Buddhist school. It doesn't provide the practice side. It remains just a philosophical critique, I think.
So, what irked the Japanese establishment more? Was it the doctrinal rejection of Buddha nature and the idea that there is some kind of positive self, or was it the fact that these people, was it the nature of the rhetoric itself which was challenging orthodoxy?
Well, I think it's both. I've heard people say to me that, well, if you accept what they say, then all of Japanese Buddhism is not Buddhism. So, and that's, of course, not very popular. But it was also the rhetoric. They're very, forthright and unusually critical. Usually in Japanese debates, you say, well, yeah, I suppose you're right, but, it's not like, no, you're wrong. So yeah, that sort of attitude, and also, I mean, it's very hierarchical in Japan. You know, you're supposed to be, you know, pay your respects to your sensei. You know,
Harmony is to be valued.
And they were criticizing Takasaki and Nagao and these, you know, the top tier of Japanese Buddhist scholars, and
I think also, you know, the social side of it, because as I said, this was in the context both wider but also within the Japanese Buddhist world, and you know, they're rubbing the establishment nose right in it. You know, not only is this not Buddhism, but you know, you guys were warmongers, and we have records, and there's probably reparations to be paid. And you know, your grandmother's grave in that temple, which proved that you are a Korean and therefore part of the outcast community, you know, and this was the temple that was, you know, so they rubbed people's faces in it, and again, in a very non-Japanese way, you know, they were not conforming to the proper ways of, you know, harmony, the rules. They were breaking all the rules of harmony, but again, it had real implications. And I remember again, Hakamaya, I mean, he has a lot of fun lines, but they wouldn't let him actually resign his position in the Soto Zen school, and he said, I told you, Jamie, it's just like the mafia. The only way out is in a pine box. and I mean, and that was kind of his opinion about the way about the kind of closure of the Japanese establishment Buddhist world. So, you know, they were you know, ruffling a lot of feathers in real terms. I think even more than philosophical. I'm not so sure too many Japanese people outside of some very rarefied university, you know, University of Tokyo and Kyoto, could even follow the argument, frankly speaking.
Yeah, and there's one article where Hakamaya talks specifically about the Japanese concept of wa, which is supposed to be one of the great virtues of Japanese society, of harmony and getting along with everyone. And he says, well, wa, I mean, that can be a very restricting, forceful conformity. You know, so he's criticizing the Japanese social system of forced conformity, which can again lead to a kind of authoritarianism, and what he saw and many people see as you know, the pre-war situation, which led to the World War, and he saw aspects of that coming out again. You mentioned Nakasone and kind of a return, you know, this kind of a romantic return to kind of, let's make Japan great again by, you know, everyone conforming to
and don't question the authority, you know, don't critically question authority.
So that was part of their critique, you know, whether that fits with, you know, the idea of Buddha nature or not is another question, but.
Have there been any long-term repercussions of this? I mean, is it nowadays, do people still, do they look back upon this as a historical, intellectual curiosity, a blip that kind of just went away, or has it had any long-term repercussions?
I mean, there was you know, it got a lot of attention for a while, and that kind of tempest has passed, but it's still going on. It hasn't disappeared, and you see it a lot where people give papers, and they're not representing critical Buddhism necessarily, but they can't say anything about Buddha nature or the Nirvana Sutta or whatever without kind of touch. Well, you know, of course, Hakamaya and them have pointed out that there are problems with this, but, you know, and I mentioned earlier, you know, a paper that I heard of someone critiquing the Honganji social activity based on what, you know, critical Buddhism. So it's here and there still, but it's not a movement in the sense that, you know, there's a core group of people who are continuing to make this critique. In fact, about 10 years ago, it was inevitable because Hakamaya and Matsumoto are both very strong in their opinions, but they finally reached a point where Matsumoto gave a paper and said, I'm announcing my divorce from Hakamaya and going my own way, and this is what I think. And so, it's not a cohesive movement in the sense of a core group of continuing their kind of critique.
Yeah, in that sense, that the furor has passed and the controversy in a big way has passed. However, as Paul was saying, I think that now in and around lots of other critiques, sort of social, political, historical critiques about the Japanese establishment's involvement with this, that, and the other thing, I think nobody can talk about these things anymore without, knowing that in fact it's not all a beautiful, harmonious situation out there, and that Japan, the Japanese Buddhist establishment, does have these kinds of roles, and so they go back to doctrinal issues as well. And so, you can no longer talk about some pristine. Oh, this is good because it goes great to Shentong Rentong. Yeah, you can't talk about some pristine Japanese Buddhist reality that exists outside of the very messy, real Japanese Buddhist establishment that involves Buddhists with bodies. And these Buddhists with bodies have these ideas, and these, their metaphysical presuppositions inform their ethical, personally, individually, as well as in terms of denomination, their activity in the world. And I think nowadays, nobody in Japan can talk about Buddhism in a kind of D.T. Suzuki Orientalist sort of fashion anymore, ignoring the social realities as though there's some pristine thing that's Zen and pure and perfect that exists somehow differently. I don't think that conversation can happen anymore. I think they're past that. So in that sense, it's not a furor and a controversy anymore, but I don't think, as Paul said, you can't ignore these when you talk about it anymore.
They've lost their innocence.